For over 1,000 years, Jerusalem had been the heart of faith, the place where heaven and earth met, where the divine presence had made its home among the people of Israel. The stones of this city had witnessed the rise and fall of kings, the triumph of prophets, and the unbroken hope of a people chosen by God. This was no ordinary city. It was a sacred monument to faith itself, the center of Jewish worship and the eternal symbol of divine covenant. In the 6th century BC, when the great Babylonian Empire had swept through the region, it left Jerusalem in ruin, but even then the city rose again. Under King Solomon, it had become the most glorious of cities, crowned by a temple so grand it was said to be a reflection of the heavenly throne itself. For generations, the people of Israel had gathered in its courts, praying for salvation and rejoicing in the glory of the Almighty. This was the city of David, a place of refuge and power, where the mighty and the humble alike found solace. But by the 1st century, the world that Jerusalem had known was no more. The Romans, under the leadership of Pompey, had come sweeping across the land in 63 BC, laying siege to the city and eventually placing it under imperial rule. The grand temple was desecrated, but Jerusalem did not fall. It remained a beacon, an unbroken thread of hope in the world of Roman might. Under the shadow of the empire, the Jewish people continued to worship and endure. But the price was steep. The Roman peace, Pax Romana, was a farce, a heavy hand veiled in the guise of protection.
The city's faith and devotion were undying, but the tension between Roman authority and Jewish independence grew with each passing day. Beneath the grandeur of the temple and the unyielding walls of Jerusalem, a simmering unrest was building, fueled by the oppressive rule of Roman governors, their taxes, and their disregard for Jewish customs. The anger of the people was palpable as they saw their land, their culture, and their very identity being slowly eroded by an empire that sought to impose its will at all costs. This was the Jerusalem that stood at the edge of a precipice, a city that had survived centuries of invasions and rebellions, yet now found itself in a battle not just for survival, but for its soul. And by the year 66 AD, the first sparks of revolt had already begun to smolder, igniting a fire that would consume the city and forever change the course of history. All right, if you're still watching, don't just sit there in silence. Tell us where you're watching from. Drop a comment below and let us know which part of the world you're tuning in from. We want to hear your story. And for those of you who still haven't subscribed yet, kindly tell us why. What's stopping you? We put everything into making content like this, and it's time you show some love. Let us know in the comments why you're still holding out. We're listening.
By the time the Roman Empire had cast its shadow over the known world, Jerusalem had already stood for over 1,000 years as a symbol of unwavering faith, a testament to the enduring spirit of a people chosen by God. From the reign of King David, who established the city as the eternal heart of Israel around 1000 BC, to the magnificent temple built by Herod between 2010 BC, this city had been more than a place. It was the very soul of Jewish identity. Every stone, every column, every inch of the city had been carved with the memories of miracles, battles, and divine promises. The temple, Herod's masterpiece, rose above the city like a beacon, its golden walls reflecting the light of the Almighty, a physical embodiment of the covenant between God and His people. It wasn't just a structure. It was the spiritual nucleus, where the heavens themselves were believed to touch the earth. The city was alive with the hum of daily sacrifices, prayers echoing through its streets, as faithful Jews gathered from all corners of the world to worship the one true God. But as the empire's power stretched across continents, the Roman presence in Jerusalem grew, and with it, the tension between Roman might and Jewish faith. While the city remained a sacred symbol to its people, it had become mere a province in the empire's vast territory.
Jerusalem, once independent and free, now stood on the edge, caught between its divine heritage and the crushing weight of imperial control. The question was no longer if the city would break, but when. And in the year 66 AD, that breaking point came. The peaceful city of David, the center of faith and hope for an entire people, was about to become the battleground for their survival and their very existence.
Herod's reign, from 37 to 4 BC, was a masterclass in political maneuvering, but it was also a time of profound contradictions. On one hand, he was a king of grand ambition, a man whose architectural feats still stand as a testament to his vision and his ego. He transformed Jerusalem, elevating the city's splendor to new heights. The temple, which he expanded and rebuilt, became a marvel of the ancient world, its golden walls shining in the sunlight, a symbol of Jewish faith and pride. Herod also constructed the massive fortress of Masada, a place that would later become synonymous with resistance. His works were designed to awe, to prove that under his rule, Jerusalem would shine brighter than ever before. But behind the grandeur, the manipulation and ruthlessness of his reign were undeniable. Herod, though he held the title of king, was never fully trusted by the people. A client king under Roman rule, he was forced to balance the delicate act of maintaining loyalty to Rome while appeasing a population that saw him as little more than a puppet of the empire. To the Romans, he was a stabilizing force in a volatile province, but to the Jewish people, he was a symbol of oppression, a king who betrayed his own people to secure his throne. Herod's marriage alliances, his ruthless executions, and his constant attempts to suppress dissent only deepened the resentment. The people of Jerusalem saw him as a man who would do anything to stay in power, even sacrifice their own traditions and faith to please the empire. While he built a city of grandeur, his subjects lived in fear, knowing that a man capable of such monumental projects was equally capable of crushing anyone who opposed him. Herod's reign, while marked by architectural brilliance, was also one of cruelty and political gamesmanship. A king who feared for his crown at every turn, and whose cruelty would leave an indelible mark on the Jewish psyche for generations to come.
The year was 66 AD, and Jerusalem, once a city of sacred grandeur, had become a simmering cauldron of resentment. The people had endured Roman rule for decades, but the weight of it had only grown heavier with time. What began as a subtle erosion of Jewish life had evolved into a harsh, undeniable oppression, a pressure cooker of political, economic, and spiritual frustrations that was now on the verge of explosion. At the heart of this unrest lay Rome's unrelenting taxation system, which, over the years, had bled the Jewish population dry. Roman taxes were not just financial demands, they were a daily reminder of subjugation. The empire had a simple rule: take what you can and squeeze the conquered until they were utterly dependent. In the case of Judea, the taxes were crushing. It wasn't just the wealthier landowners who felt it, but every single citizen. Merchants, farmers, the poor in the streets, they all paid, their livelihoods stripped to feed the insatiable Roman war machine. But it wasn't only the amount or frequency of the taxes that fueled Jewish anger. It was the manner in which they were collected. The Roman tax collectors were not merely bureaucrats, they were ruthless enforcers, often Jewish collaborators who had betrayed their own people for a share of the spoils. The tax system was a hammer that did not just shatter economic security, but also trampled the dignity of the Jewish people. The Romans did not understand the sacred laws that governed Jewish life. Their taxes didn't just extract wealth, they extracted respect. The people were forced to acknowledge an empire that had no understanding of the spiritual depth of their beliefs.
The situation was made worse by the Roman officials who governed the region. These were men sent by the empire, but many were ignorant of or indifferent to the cultural and religious complexities of the Jewish world. They saw Judea as a rebellious province, a problem to be managed, and their policies reflected that disdain. What the Romans failed to grasp was that for the Jewish people, religion was not a matter of choice. It was the very core of their existence. Everything they did was bound by their belief in the one true God. Their laws, their culture, their identity, they were all tied to their faith. The Roman officials, however, imposed policies that directly challenged the very essence of Jewish identity. In 6 AD, the census was ordered. To the Jews, this was an act of sacrilege, a violation of their belief that only God could count his people. The Romans saw it as a mere administrative task, but for the Jewish community, it was nothing less than an affront to their covenant with God. They had already endured the humiliations of foreign rule, but this was too much. Being counted as mere subjects of the emperor, as if they were cattle, was a direct violation of everything they believed. Over time, these grievances festered. Each Roman edict, each unjust tax, each insensitivity towards Jewish religious practices stoked the fire of discontent. The Roman Empire, vast and powerful, had shown time and time again that it was willing to crush any form of resistance with its military might, but in doing so, it failed to understand that what it was facing in Judea was not just a political uprising, it was a religious crisis. The Jewish people had lived under foreign rulers before. They had survived under the Greeks, the Babylonians, and even the Persians. But there was a difference now. The Romans weren't just another foreign power. They were a power that actively sought to erase the very foundations of Jewish life. Their taxes and policies didn't just undermine Jewish autonomy, they attacked the sanctity of Jewish faith itself.
In response to this growing tension, the Jews did not simply react with anger. What they experienced was something deeper, a sense of betrayal, as if their God had abandoned them to a foreign empire that didn't understand their deepest values. The cultural and religious tensions boiled over into violence, as radical groups within the Jewish community began to rise up against Roman oppression. What began as sporadic protests in the streets turned into a full-scale rebellion in 66 AD. The revolt was not simply about taxes, not simply about political independence. It was about preserving their very identity in a world that threatened to swallow them whole. In the year 6 AD, a single decision sent shockwaves through Jerusalem, igniting a fury that would burn for decades. The Roman Empire, vast and untouchable, had long imposed its will on the people of Judea. But this act, the order for a census, carried out by Quirinius, the Roman governor of Syria, was the spark that set an ancient city ablaze. To the empire, it was just a routine administrative task, a way to measure wealth, to count the subjects of a far-flung province. To the Jews, it was a sacrilege. The idea that a foreign power could catalog the people of Israel was an affront not just to their political independence, but to their very identity. Jerusalem, the city where King David had established his eternal kingdom, where the presence of God was believed to dwell in the Holy of Holies, could never be reduced to a mere statistic. For generations, the Jewish people had lived under foreign rulers. But this was different. This was an attack on their soul. The act of being counted, numbered, reduced to property, to flesh and bone without divine purpose, was more than just a tax. It was a repudiation of everything the Jewish faith stood for. In the Torah, there was a story of King David, a king beloved by God, who had once made the mistake of counting his people. In that moment of pride, a plague fell upon Israel, claiming the lives of 70,000. The lesson was clear. To be counted by a foreign empire was to court disaster. The census was more than just a violation of civil rights, it was an assault on the very covenant between God and his people.
The anger that simmered beneath the surface for so long now boiled over. This was the final straw. The streets of Jerusalem, usually filled with the quiet rhythm of prayer, the bustle of markets, and the hum of everyday life, suddenly felt charged with an electric sense of defiance. Men and women who had quietly borne the yoke of Roman rule began to gather in small groups, their voices rising in anger. Whispers turned to shouts. Shall we submit to this? Shall we let them number us as cattle? In the heart of the city, a voice rose above the noise. Judas of Galilee, a man from the region that had long resisted Roman influence. His words burned like fire, spreading through the crowds. "We are free children of Abraham," he cried. "The Most High alone shall count us. No man, no emperor, no foreign power." His call to reject the census was not merely about taxes. It was a declaration of religious and cultural independence. It was the rallying cry for a revolution. For the Jewish people, it wasn't just a census. It was the first true challenge to their very existence. To comply would be to surrender everything they had fought for, but to resist would bring the might of the Roman Empire down upon them. The path forward was not clear, but the die was cast. The Jewish revolt had begun, not in the dark corners of the city, but in the very heart of their faith. By the time the rebellion had spread through Judea, it was no longer a protest against taxes or political oppression. It was a war for the soul of the Jewish people, a war between their sacred laws and an empire that saw them as nothing more than subjects. And from that single act, from that single decree, the fire of rebellion would consume Jerusalem and lead to a violent reckoning that would forever alter the course of history. In the heart of Jerusalem, the air was thick with resentment. The city, once a proud symbol of Jewish independence, was now divided in ways that went beyond walls and gates. On one side stood the Sadducees, the priestly class, the wealthy elite who lived in grand homes adorned with the finest tapestries and rarest perfumes. They dined on delicacies imported from across the empire, their every need catered to by servants who whispered Roman commands into their ears. Their lives were an unbroken cycle of feasts, prayers, and political maneuvering, each step taken to ensure their hold on power, both spiritual and temporal. Yet the luxury they enjoyed came at a price paid by the very people they were supposed to serve. To the common folk, the Sadducees were no longer leaders, but collaborators. They had bent their knees to Rome, forging alliances with the very empire that trampled on Jewish sovereignty. In return, they had been rewarded with wealth and privilege, their coffers filled while the people starved. These men, once seen as the protectors of faith, had turned their backs on the very people who worshipped in the shadow of their temple. They had chosen comfort, securing their places in the Roman world over the struggle for freedom. They were the puppet kings of the empire, and the common people could see it in every lavish robe, every golden cup. But while the Sadducees feasted, Jerusalem's streets were a battleground of survival. The common people, those who worked the land, who tilled the earth, who prayed fervently in the dust, were crushed under the weight of Roman taxation. Their lives were a daily struggle for scraps, their families hungry, their homes modest at best. The temple, once a symbol of hope, had become a cold monument to their oppression. And each year, as taxes were levied higher and higher, their desperation deepened. The Romans, with their relentless demands, had drained them of what little they had left, leaving them with nothing but their faith and their anger. For the common Jew, the Sadducees' wealth was a constant reminder of what they could never have.
The priests lived in palaces. They lived as if untouched by the suffering of the people. Meanwhile, the poor were forced to make impossible choices. How to feed their children, how to keep the faith when the empire was ever tightening its grip. Theirs was a life of quiet desperation, their dreams crushed beneath the weight of imperial oppression and internal betrayal.
But it wasn't just their poverty that fueled their anger. It was the betrayal. They saw the Sadducees as a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. How could the temple, once a symbol of God's promise to his people, now be the home of those who served foreign kings, who kissed the boots of Rome? The common Jews longed for something more, something real. They yearned for a return to the days when their leaders fought for their freedom, when the Maccabees had risen up to reclaim their land and their sovereignty. That was their dream, and it had been crushed beneath the weight of Rome and the complacency of their own leaders. And so, in 66 AD, after years of silent suffering, the fuse was lit. It wasn't just the taxes that drove them to rebellion. It was the belief that the soul of their people, their very identity, was being stolen from them. The poor, who had endured enough, could no longer remain silent. The revolt that began as whispers on the streets soon spread like wildfire as the oppressed turned their anger into action. The first blows of the rebellion were not struck in the form of swords, but in defiance. Defiance against a system that had stripped them of their rights, their faith, and their dignity. The Roman presence, long seen as a distant tyranny, was no longer just an external enemy. It had become a personal affront, a visible, suffocating force that was bleeding the life from the land. The revolt wasn't just against Roman oppression, it was against a corrupt system that had allowed the rich to thrive while the poor were left to rot. And as the flames of rebellion spread, there was no turning back. The rebellion was not simply a fight for political autonomy, it was a fight for the very soul of Jerusalem. As the Roman legions gathered outside the towering walls of Jerusalem in 70 AD, Titus stood on the precipice of history. His orders were simple: break the city, break its spirit, and secure a decisive victory for Rome. Yet as he stared at the high, unyielding walls before him, even he, a seasoned general, couldn't help but feel the weight of the challenge settle like a stone in his gut. This was not a typical rebellion. Jerusalem was a city unlike any other. This was the heart of Jewish faith, a city that had withstood centuries of invaders and empires, each one leaving its mark, yet never breaking. How could the might of Rome crush a city that had survived so much? Titus knew that the stakes were higher than just one city. This would be the defining moment of his career. A failure here would be remembered for centuries, not as a mere loss in battle, but as a shame that would echo throughout the empire. The pressure was unbearable. His father, Vespasian, the emperor himself, watched with eyes that saw only results. There was no room for hesitation, no allowance for failure. But even the greatest of generals could not ignore the nagging doubts that lingered in the back of his mind. At first, the strategy seemed sound. Rome's military might was unchallenged. The siege towers, the battering rams, the disciplined legions, they had all proven their effectiveness in past campaigns. How could Jerusalem hold out? Titus had seen the defenders within the city, divided, outnumbered, and starving. Surely this would be quick. But as the days turned into weeks, as the city's defiant resistance became more organized, and as the constant barrage of stone and fire rained down on his men, Titus began to question everything he had believed about this mission. The Jews were not just fighting for their city. They were fighting for their faith, their very survival, and that made them far more dangerous than any army he had ever faced. The initial confidence that had driven him forward began to erode. The walls seemed insurmountable, the city's defenders relentless. What was meant to be a swift victory became an agonizing war of attrition. Titus's soldiers, weary from constant battle, began to show signs of frustration. Morale was faltering. Some of the legions, so accustomed to easy victories, began to question their own capabilities. The siege that was supposed to prove Rome's dominance was now testing its very strength. Titus walked the battlefield daily, surveying the damage, speaking with his officers, and watching as his men bled, starved, and fell. With each failed assault, the doubt gnawed at him. What if they couldn't break the city? What if this, the great city of God, was different? The people here fought with a fervor, a faith that no Roman tactic could extinguish. They were desperate, cornered, and yet the resistance seemed to grow with every passing day. It was then that the whispers began. Whispers of divine retribution. The rebels, having nothing left to lose, began to speak openly of their belief that God himself would deliver them from Roman hands. Was it possible? Could he, Titus, truly be going up against something more powerful than Roman steel? For a fleeting moment, doubt crept into his mind. Could the gods be on their side? Could the Jewish people truly be fighting with the favor of heaven? But Titus, ever pragmatic, shook off the superstition. No, this was not divine intervention. This was a battle of might, of strategy, of resolve. He would not let the myths of gods and destiny cloud his judgment. But as the siege dragged on, the cost of his resolve became clearer both to him and to his men. The casualties were mounting. The defenders grew more desperate, but their resistance grew even fiercer. Was this rebellion about more than just defending a city? Was it about something that would not be measured in blood or gold?
Titus made his decision. The final assault. It was time to end this, to crush the heart of the rebellion once and for all. But as the final wave of Roman soldiers advanced on the temple, Titus had no way of knowing that this would be the moment that would change everything. It would not be just the fall of a city. It would be the end of an era. Titus, resolute, raised his sword to signal the assault. But just as the legions moved forward, a sound, a rumble unlike any he had ever heard, rose from within the city walls. The defenders, whose strength had already defied the odds, unleashed a final fury of their own, a fury that would shake the foundations of the empire itself. It was a mission that would define the legacy of Titus and, by extension, the fate of Rome. In 66 AD, when Emperor Nero issued his command, it was not just a call to action. It was a test of everything Titus had learned as a military leader. The rebellion in Judea was no small matter. This was Jerusalem, a city with a history that transcended mere politics. It was the heart of the Jewish faith, a symbol of defiance that had survived centuries of empires. To quell the rebellion here would be more than a show of military strength. It would be a statement, and Titus was tasked with ensuring that the empire's message was received loud and clear. Rome is unbreakable. At first glance, the odds seemed stacked in Rome's favor. Titus had the might of the Roman military behind him, a force of seasoned veterans with no equal in the ancient world. The legions were filled with men who had bled in Gaul, fought in Egypt, and marched across the vastness of Asia Minor. They were warriors forged by years of combat, disciplined to the point of perfection. Every soldier knew his place, his weapon, and his strategy. The Romans had mastered warfare on every level: tactics, siege engines, and unyielding strength. To them, the rebellion in Judea was an inconvenience, a thorn in the side of a mighty empire to be swiftly eradicated.
But Rome's confidence, grounded in the superiority of its military might, was built on a dangerous assumption that the enemy could be broken by force alone. Titus, as experienced as he was, could not have predicted the true challenge Jerusalem posed. The city's defenders, though few in number, fought with a fanatical fervor that made them nearly impossible to defeat in conventional ways. They were not just rebels, they were willing to die for their cause, for their faith, and for a city that was the center of their world. Titus had seen cities fall before, had led his men to victory after victory, but none had been like this. None had been a battle for the soul of a people, a fight that stretched beyond the walls of the city and into the hearts of every man and woman who believed in Jerusalem's divine protection. What Rome had not accounted for was the spiritual strength of the defenders. This wasn't just a political rebellion. It was a clash of civilizations, of belief, of destiny itself. As Titus surveyed the city from the high ground, the first cracks in his confidence began to show. The walls of Jerusalem loomed before him, massive and unyielding, a reminder that victory would not be handed to him. The Romans had their siege towers, their battering rams, and their legionnaires ready for battle. But these walls had withstood invaders before, and there was a sense among the defenders that this time God Himself was watching over them. The city's streets were a labyrinth, and inside its walls, the defenders had more than just weapons. They had the indomitable will to resist. In the eyes of Titus, this was no longer just a military engagement. He was not fighting against soldiers alone. He was fighting against an idea, against a belief so strong that it could turn a city into a fortress. His mind raced, calculating the cost of the siege, the toll it would take on his men. The longer this rebellion lasted, the more his victory would be tainted by loss.
And then there was the pressure of his father, Emperor Vespasian, who demanded results. In Rome, a prolonged siege would be seen as weakness, and weakness could not be tolerated. But the longer Titus waited outside the gates of Jerusalem, the more the sense of urgency gripped him. Time was running out. Each day brought more death, more suffering, and more questions that Titus was struggling to answer. Was this battle really just about military power? Or was there something more at play? Something he couldn't control? Titus made the decision to push forward, to break the walls of Jerusalem and claim victory. Yet, as his legions advanced toward the outer defenses, a strange sense of unease gripped him. Was he underestimating the strength of the city? Was he really ready to face whatever lay beyond these walls? As the siege progressed, the tension grew thicker. The Romans, powerful as they were, began to feel the weight of their campaign. The air grew heavier with the stench of death and desperation. The legions, which had once marched with the confidence of inevitable victory, now found themselves bogged down in a war of attrition. The defenders fought back, not with the might of armies, but with the strength of a people who believed that the very fate of their faith rested on the outcome of this battle. And then, just as it seemed that the Romans might finally breach the walls, something unexpected happened. Something that would force Titus to question everything. A messenger arrived with news that would shift the course of the siege forever. The rebellion, it seemed, was not just a local issue anymore. It had spread to other parts of the empire. Rebellions were rising in the east, and Rome's resources were stretched thin. Titus now faced a dilemma. Could he afford to finish this campaign? Or was the rebellion in Jerusalem not just a battle for Judea, but the beginning of something much larger?
By 70 AD, the Roman legions had arrived, and Jerusalem was about to feel the full force of an empire determined to break it. But this was no ordinary city, and this would be no ordinary siege. Jerusalem was not just a city of stone and mortar, it was the heart of Jewish faith, a symbol of resistance to Roman rule. As Titus, the son of Emperor Vespasian, looked out over the ancient walls, he knew this was more than just a military campaign. This was a test of Rome's indomitable power, a challenge that would either solidify their dominance or shake the empire to its core. From the moment the Romans circled the city, the psychological war began. They didn't simply want to breach Jerusalem's walls. They wanted to break the spirit of its people, to make them feel the weight of inevitable defeat, day by day. Titus knew that while his legions had the advantage in numbers and weaponry, the defenders had something he could not easily overcome: belief. The city's defenders fought not just for survival, but for their faith, their identity, and their connection to a God they believed would protect them. And that made them far more dangerous than any army Titus had faced before. The Romans didn't waste time on grand gestures. They were meticulous, methodical. The encirclement of Jerusalem was swift and absolute. Every route into the city was blocked, every supply line severed. The first wave of psychological pressure was already working. With no food, no way to escape, the city's defenders began to feel the walls closing in. Outside, Titus's engineers began constructing siege towers, massive wooden structures that would soon rise higher than the city walls. Inside those towers, Roman soldiers would be able to launch their attack from above, safely out of reach of the defenders' arrows. These towers were not just symbols of Roman might. They were instruments of fear. For days, the defenders watched helplessly as the Romans methodically advanced their siege weapons, inching closer to the city walls. Each new tower built, each new ram positioned, felt like another step toward the end. The Romans were not rushing in. They were taking their time, ensuring that the city would feel every moment of their approach. The slow, deliberate advance of Roman artillery was a reminder to the people of Jerusalem that no matter how long they fought, no matter how many battles they won, the Romans would keep coming.
The catapults began to fire their deadly projectiles, launching massive stones and fireballs into the heart of the city. The defenders were forced to scramble, trying to repair the damage to the walls, but it was futile. Every day, the bombardment continued, and each impact felt like a hammer strike against the soul of the city. Jerusalem had always been a symbol of resilience, but now, under the relentless pounding of Roman artillery, even the walls seemed to tremble. The once unshakable city was starting to show cracks, and the defenders knew it. But it wasn't just the physical damage that threatened to bring them down, it was the isolation. With no way to bring in reinforcements or food, the city's defenders grew weaker by the day. Starvation set in, and with it, fear. The once proud walls of Jerusalem, which had stood as a symbol of strength and faith, now seemed like a prison. The people inside could hear the distant rumble of the siege engines, the whistling of the stones as they flew through the air, and the deafening crashes as they struck the city. It was a constant, crushing reminder that there was no escape. Titus knew this. He understood the power of psychological warfare better than anyone. He didn't just want to breach the walls. He wanted to break the will of the people inside. He understood that the longer the siege lasted, the more the defenders would begin to question their own resolve. The constant bombardment, the slow encirclement, the feeling of being trapped inside a dying city, it was all part of the plan. The Romans weren't just aiming for the gates or the walls, they were aiming for the minds of the people inside. As the days turned into weeks, the defenders grew more desperate. They turned on each other, factions within the city breaking out into violent clashes over the dwindling supplies. Once united by their faith and their shared purpose, they were now splintering under the pressure. The city that had once been a symbol of divine protection was now a city unraveling from the inside out.
And then, just as it seemed the Romans were about to breach the walls entirely, something unexpected happened. A messenger arrived, his face pale with fear, bearing news that would shake the foundations of the siege. Inside the city, the last remaining defenders were preparing for a final stand. But what would happen when the Romans finally broke through? Could they crush the rebellion with one final assault, or would something far worse emerge? Something that no one, not even Titus, could have predicted. By mid-70 AD, Jerusalem was no longer the thriving, proud city it once had been. The bustling streets, where the voices of traders and the calls of the faithful had once filled the air, were now eerily silent. The city had become a living graveyard, its soul slowly being crushed under the weight of starvation, disease, and despair. What had once been the beating heart of Jewish life was now a carcass, its people mere shadows of who they had been. The walls of the city, which had once stood as symbols of divine protection, now felt like the cruel, suffocating prison they had become. The siege had taken its toll. No longer could Jerusalem's defenders rely on the luxuries they once took for granted. The markets which had bustled with goods and hope were now empty. The once rich breadbasket of Jerusalem was now a barren, hopeless place. Food had become a rare commodity, and every scrap was fought over, not by armies at the gates, but by the men, women, and children inside the city. The streets, once lined with families and travelers, were now barren, save for the sick, the desperate, and the dead. The very air seemed to hang heavy with decay, as each breath was harder to take, each day more excruciating than the last.
The first sign of the city's collapse came in the form of hunger. The elite, who once feasted in opulent homes, were now forced to fight for even the smallest crumbs of bread. Their once high and mighty positions had no value in a city where food could not be bought but only taken by force. The poor, who had long lived on the edge, now found themselves in a desperate, violent struggle for survival. With no fresh supplies, no help from the outside world, the once proud citizens of Jerusalem had become scavengers. The hungry bodies of the fallen littered the streets, the once pure air now tinged with the smell of rot and desperation. Then came the disease. It crept in quietly at first, like an unseen predator, but soon it ravaged the city. The sick, once protected within the sanctity of their homes, now flooded the streets in a desperate, painful search for anything that might offer relief. The stench of fever and death filled the air, the cries of the dying mingling with the echoes of the city's crumbling walls. The diseases spread quickly, fueled by the unbearable conditions, the tight spaces, the filth, and the lack of water. Those who weren't dying from starvation were dying from plague. But it wasn't just the physical toll that was breaking the city, it was the emotional collapse. The defenders of Jerusalem, who had once been unified by their faith, were now divided, torn apart by internal strife. Factions that had once fought side by side now turned their weapons on one another. The Zealots, the last remaining military force inside the city, had lost their unity. The bitter infighting between different factions escalated. What was supposed to be a rebellion against the Romans had become a civil war inside the very walls that had once promised protection. This fragmentation wasn't just political, it was spiritual. The people of Jerusalem had always believed that their God would protect them, that their city was divinely guarded. But now, as the siege dragged on, doubts began to creep in. The defenders whispered among themselves, wondering if their faith had failed them. Were they truly chosen? Or was this the punishment for their defiance of Rome, for their pride? The temple, once a place of hope and faith, now stood like a ghostly monument to everything they had lost. The defenders who had once looked to it for divine intervention now saw it as a symbol of their helplessness.
As the internal strife worsened, trust eroded. Neighbors turned on neighbors.
Families betrayed each other in the hope of securing a better share of dwindling resources. The walls of Jerusalem, which had once been seen as invincible, now stood as a terrifying reminder of their isolation. Outside, the Romans were closing in. Inside, there was no refuge, only fear and a growing sense of hopelessness. Every cry for help went unanswered. Every prayer felt hollow. The city that had once been filled with the spirit of life was now just a dying echo. And then, just as it seemed the defenders might be on the brink of total collapse, something unexpected happened. A voice, one of the last voices of hope, called out to the people. A leader, a zealot who had once promised them deliverance. The message was simple. Hold on for just a little longer. Help is coming. But was it? Or was this just another false hope, another empty promise that would dissolve like so many others? Outside the walls, the Romans grew closer, their siege works now only a few steps away from breaching the city's final defenses. The weight of the siege pressed down on every soul inside. Time was running out, and the flicker of hope that had once burned so brightly in the hearts of Jerusalem's defenders was now little more than a fading spark in a sea of despair. By the spring of 70 AD, as the Romans tightened their siege on Jerusalem, internal divisions among the city's defenders had become impossible to ignore. The once unified resistance had fractured into competing factions, each led by powerful men with differing visions for the future of Jerusalem. This division was not merely political, it was a matter of survival. The city's leadership was split between those who demanded total independence from Rome and those who believed that negotiating for limited autonomy was the only way to preserve their people.
John of Gisela, leader of the Zealot faction, was the most radical in his approach. His group was committed to absolute defiance against the Roman Empire, believing that no compromise would be acceptable. John's leadership was marked by fiery rhetoric and a deep commitment to religious purity. To him, any form of negotiation with Rome was a betrayal of God and the Jewish people. He led his faction with an uncompromising desire for total independence, willing to risk everything, including the city's survival, to maintain that vision. In contrast, Simon bar Giora represented a more pragmatic, albeit still militant, approach. A former slave who had fought for his freedom, Simon believed that survival was the priority. Though he would not bow to Roman rule, he argued that negotiating some form of autonomy with the Romans was the best chance for preserving Jerusalem and its people. His vision was one of a Jewish Jerusalem under Roman supervision, not total independence, but the idea was increasingly unpopular as the siege wore on. Eleazar ben Simon, another influential leader, found himself at odds with both John and Simon, despite initially sharing their zeal for resistance. His faction had originally pushed for uncompromising independence, but as the situation grew more dire, Eleazar's refusal to consider any sort of compromise isolated him from potential allies. His unwillingness to negotiate or entertain differing viewpoints created further instability within the already fractured defenses of the city. His leadership style, marked by stubbornness and inflexibility, made it difficult to unify the defenders, even as the Roman legions closed in. The infighting between these factions, driven by egos and clashing ideologies, made a coordinated defense nearly impossible. While the Romans built their siege works and advanced steadily, the defenders were consumed by internal strife. John's radicals clashed with Simon's more moderate rebels, and Eleazar's uncompromising zealots refused to work with anyone outside their faction. This lack of unity meant that even as the Roman siege engines drew closer, Jerusalem's defenders were not operating as a single cohesive force.
The growing chaos and lack of coordination had dire consequences. The factions' petty disputes, their pride, and their refusal to work together left the people of Jerusalem vulnerable. Food was running out, morale was plummeting, and the leaders, caught in their own power struggles, failed to provide the direction the city desperately needed. The Roman advance, methodical and relentless, began to feel inevitable. As the Romans prepared for their final assault, the question was no longer whether Jerusalem would fall, it was how much longer the defenders would hold out before their fractured leadership brought the city to its knees. Could the factions reconcile in time to offer a unified resistance? Or would their division guarantee the city's destruction?
In early July 70 AD, after weeks of relentless bombardment, the first wall of Jerusalem finally crumbled. The impact was immediate, and the city, already reeling from hunger, disease, and internal chaos, now faced an existential blow. As the dust settled and the echoes of the collapse faded, a heavy silence hung over the defenders. Their first line of defense had fallen, and with it, the last vestiges of their hope. For the defenders, the wall's collapse was not just a physical loss, it was a psychological shattering. This was the moment they had feared. The once impenetrable fortifications that had stood for centuries were no more. The people of Jerusalem, who had clung to the belief that their walls were their salvation, now realized that their defenses were as fragile as the resolve of their leaders. The first breach was the beginning of their undoing, and the realization hit them like a cold wind. There was no immediate unified response. The streets, once filled with the energy of rebellion, fell into stunned quiet. Some defenders, paralyzed by shock, simply stared at the gap in the wall. Others scrambled in a desperate attempt to organize a counteroffensive. The Zealots, led by John of Gischala, rallied their troops, shouting that this was the moment of reckoning, the moment when God would deliver Jerusalem. But even their fiery words, once capable of stirring thousands, now felt hollow against the cold, calculating efficiency of the Roman advance. Panic spread, but there was still resistance. The Zealots, fanatical in their belief, refused to accept surrender. Their reaction to the breach was not fear, but a renewed call to fight, to stand firm, to die for the city. Yet their resolve was met with increasing disorder. They lacked the resources, the unity, and the leadership to mount a meaningful defense. Divisions within their own ranks, fueled by egos and differing visions of what Jerusalem's future should be, prevented any coherent strategy from forming. Eleazar ben Simon, a key leader of the rebels, was a man consumed by his desire for total independence. He fought not just for the city, but for his vision of it, an unbending, uncompromising resistance. His faction, though passionate, lacked the tactical knowledge to hold the line against a disciplined, relentless enemy.
Meanwhile, Simon bar Giora, who had once been one of the more moderate voices among the rebels, found his own faction divided. Some of his men, demoralized by the constant bombardment and starvation, began whispering that negotiation with the Romans was the only way to save what remained of Jerusalem. Others refused to listen, still clinging to the belief that divine intervention was just around the corner. Simon, caught in this ideological rift, struggled to keep his faction united. His call for negotiation was seen by many as weak, even traitorous. The battle lines, both literal and ideological, were becoming impossible to navigate. The Romans, led by Titus, pressed forward with unyielding precision. While the defenders bickered and fractured, the Roman legions advanced with military efficiency. Their siege engines, tireless and steady, tore through the remaining walls, and the Roman infantry took their position just outside the city's gates. There was no mercy, no pause in their relentless drive. The Romans had no interest in negotiation or compromise. They were methodical in their approach, their strength a constant, inevitable force. The contrast could not have been clearer. The rebels, divided, exhausted, and hungry, could not mount a unified defense. Their leadership was fractured by ego, ambition, and infighting. John of Gischala's extremists wanted complete defiance,
while Simon's pragmatists sought survival through compromise. Eleazar ben Simon's zealotry, while noble in intent, was no match for the coordinated, unwavering attack of the Romans. Their disorganization was their greatest enemy, and it was quickly proving to be their downfall. By now, the defenders' morale had sunk to a new low. Once confident in their walls, they were now trapped in a city that felt smaller with every passing day. The Romans had broken through their first line of defense, and there was no longer any illusion that they could hold on forever. The siege was no longer just about surviving. It was about how long they could continue to resist the inevitable.
As the Romans closed in, the factions inside Jerusalem turned on each other, each leader fighting to secure his own vision of the future, each unwilling to give ground. The city, once a symbol of strength, now lay fractured, its people divided not only from the Romans, but from each other. Could they still find the will to fight? Or had their divisions sealed their fate? The Romans pressed forward, inch by inch, while the defenders, scattered and fragmented, were left with a grim question. Could they hold the city long enough to mount one last defense? Or would their divisions lead to their final destruction? And if the Romans breached the second wall, would the city's last hope disappear forever? By late July 70 AD, Jerusalem was no longer a city. It was a battleground of ideologies, a fractured remnant of what had once been a thriving, united metropolis. The Romans were closing in from all sides, their siege engines pounding relentlessly against the walls. But the real battle was not outside, it was within. The Jewish defenders, once united in their cause, were now divided by competing visions of Jerusalem's future. And as the last desperate resistance took place near the Temple Mount, the rift between the radical zealots and the moderates grew ever wider, threatening to tear the city apart from the inside. The radical factions, led by John of Gischala, held steadfast to one belief: there could be no compromise, no negotiation with Rome. Independence was the only path forward. John's words rang out in the streets, rallying his followers to die for their city, for their God, and for their faith. To him, there was no other choice, no middle ground. The defenders, in his eyes, were either with him or against him. The zealots, fiery and unyielding, were driven by a conviction so intense that they would sacrifice everything, families, lives, and the city itself, to see their vision fulfilled.
On the other side stood Simon bar Giora, whose perspective had shifted as the siege wore on. A former slave turned rebel leader, Simon had seen enough death to realize that survival, not pride, should be the priority. He argued that negotiating with Rome could secure the lives of the people. It was a hard choice, but one he believed was necessary. His approach was pragmatic, focused on the preservation of what remained of the city, even if that meant compromising with the empire. But Simon's voice was drowned out by the zealots, who saw his calls for negotiation as betrayal. Eleazar ben Simon, a leader who had once shared Simon's ideals, had become a staunch defender of absolute resistance. His intransigence, however, had alienated his own people. Though he too believed in the independence of Jerusalem, his refusal to consider any sort of compromise, even as the city starved and its walls crumbled, caused divisions within his own faction. His inability to unite his forces, his refusal to even consider negotiation, ensured that the rebels remained fragmented and unable to mount a coherent defense. Inside the city, these internal rifts created chaos. The defenders were no longer fighting as one unified force against a common enemy. Instead, they were scattered, broken into smaller factions, each with their own agenda. The Temple Mount, once the spiritual heart of Jerusalem, now became a fortress for the last pockets of resistance. John of Gischala and his zealots, entrenched within its walls, were determined to hold out at all costs. But with the Romans pressing forward
and the walls of Jerusalem crumbling, their chances of success were slim. The temple had become a symbol, not of victory, but of the city's last desperate stand.
For the civilians, the situation was no less dire. As they watched their beloved city descend into madness, the emotional toll was unbearable. They had seen their homes destroyed, their families torn apart by starvation and disease. Some had already lost loved ones to the brutal realities of war. Others now faced the brutal choice of whether to fight or to surrender. The streets, once filled with life and commerce, were now filled with silent despair. The markets were closed, the sound of children's laughter replaced by the echoes of battle. The people who had once looked to the temple for divine guidance now stood as witnesses to its destruction. They had believed, fervently, that Jerusalem was a city under divine protection. But as they watched the walls fall, the sick die in the streets, and their leaders turn against one another, doubt began to creep in. Was God truly on their side, or had they misinterpreted the signs? Was their faith enough to withstand the might of Rome, or was this the reckoning they had long feared? As the Romans breached the temple's outer gates, there was still some hope left, but it was fading fast. The Zealots, led by John of Gishalah, fought with the same fervor that had defined the early stages of the rebellion, but their strength was dwindling. The moderates, those who had once advocated for peace or surrender, were now nearly silent, their voices drowned out by the chaos of battle and the ever-growing realization that the end was near. But what of the civilians, those who had no weapons, no role in the battle but to watch from the sidelines? Were they resigned to their fate? Or did they still hold on to the faint hope that somehow, against all odds, their beloved city could survive? As the Roman legions closed in, with their banners waving just beyond the walls, the question became clear. Could the last remnants of resistance hold the city together? Or would the city's fall come not just from the siege outside, but from the deep divisions within? On August 30th, 70 AD, the Romans finally breached the Temple of Jerusalem. The roar of Roman soldiers filled the air, drowning out the last cries of defiance. The unthinkable had happened. Jerusalem's holiest place, the beating heart of its identity, was now within the grasp of its conquerors. As the gates of the temple crumbled, the defenders, already battered and fractured by months of siege, faced their ultimate moment of reckoning. For the defenders inside the temple, it was not just a physical breach, it was a profound spiritual collapse. The temple was more than a structure, it was the symbol of their unwavering faith, a sanctuary they believed would protect them. But now, as the Romans poured in, it became clear that their faith had failed them. What had once stood as a bastion of divine protection now stood as a smoldering monument to their defeat. There was no salvation, no miracle, only the harsh reality that their city, their Jerusalem, was falling before the might of the Roman Empire.
John of Gishalah, the fiery zealot leader who had fought tirelessly for Jerusalem's independence, stood in the ruins of the temple, watching as the flames spread. His face, once filled with unshakable resolve, now reflected only disbelief. For all the sacrifices, all the blood spilled in the name of resistance, the temple was no longer a refuge. It was being consumed by the fire, and with it, the final remnants of hope. The very faith that had driven him to lead this doomed rebellion now felt hollow. His dream of an independent Jerusalem had been reduced to ash. The defenders, watching their sacred temple burn, were torn between fury and desperation. Some attempted to rally, to fight back with whatever weapons they had left, but it was too late. The Roman forces, methodical and relentless, had already taken control. The zealots, fighting with all their strength, realized their efforts were futile. The walls had fallen, the temple was ablaze, and the city had been completely surrounded. The battle for Jerusalem had come to a brutal, unavoidable conclusion. Outside, the civilians, who had once filled the streets with life, watched in silence, paralyzed by the enormity of the loss. The temple wasn't just the center of their faith, it was the center of their lives.
For them, the sight of the temple in flames was a death knell for everything they had known. Some wept. Others stood in stunned silence, unable to process the tragedy unfolding before them. This was more than the fall of a building. It was the fall of a city, a people, and a way of life. The invincible Jerusalem they had once known was gone, and there would be no rebuilding. Yet even as the Romans set fire to the temple, there was still a flicker of resistance among the defenders. The Zealots, though greatly diminished in number and strength, refused to lay down their arms. The temple's fall was not just the destruction of their sanctuary. It was the last stand, the final test of their resolve. Despite the overwhelming odds, they fought as if they still believed a miracle might occur. But that belief was increasingly hollow, like a whisper against the roar of Roman war drums. As the temple burned, the question lingered. Could the last defenders of Jerusalem hold on for even one more day? The Romans had breached their most sacred site, but the city was not yet there entirely. The heart of Jerusalem had been destroyed, but there were still pockets of resistance scattered throughout the city. Would the defenders rally for a final desperate push? Or was the destruction of the temple the final breaking point, the moment when all hope truly died?
By the fall of 70 AD, the Romans had completed their conquest of Jerusalem. The city was in ruins. Its once proud walls were broken and smoldering, its streets empty, its heart ripped out. Yet it was not the walls that defined Jerusalem now. It was the survivors, the shattered remnants of a people who had lost everything. The final moments of resistance had passed, and the brutal aftermath began. For those still alive, the world had turned into a nightmare. The survivors of the siege, once so defiant in their belief that Jerusalem was protected by God, now found themselves at the mercy of the empire that had torn their city apart. The Romans, led by Titus, wasted no time in making an example of the defeated. The streets, once full of life, were now filled with the sickening sound of Roman soldiers rounding up those left alive, rebels, civilians, anyone caught in the destruction. The first blow to the defenders had been the breach of the walls. The second blow was even more brutal, the mass crucifixions. Tens of thousands were executed, crucified on the hills surrounding the city. For the survivors, this was the final blow, a physical reminder that their fight had been in vain. The bodies of the crucified hung in the scorching sun, a grotesque spectacle of death and suffering. The Romans, determined to send a clear message, showed no mercy. There were no honored deaths here, no final prayers, only the agonizing slow death of hundreds, their bodies swaying in the wind, their faces twisted in pain. Some had been rebels, others had been innocent bystanders. It didn't matter. In the eyes of the Romans, every soul was expendable. But the horrors did not stop at the crucifixions. As the city's defenders and civilians were rounded up, their fates became even darker. Thousands were sold into slavery, their lives no longer their own. Mothers and fathers were torn from their children. Families were scattered across the empire, torn apart by the forces that had once tried to hold them together. The city had been divided by ideology and factionalism, but now the survivors were divided by the will of Rome, separated, branded, and shackled. Some were taken to the mines in the far reaches of the empire, forced to labor until they were broken. Others were sent to the gladiatorial arenas, where they would fight for the entertainment of their conquerors, their lives worth no more than the sport of the Roman elite.
In the ruins of Jerusalem, the sounds of life were replaced with the cries of the condemned, the screams of the broken. The air, thick with smoke and ash from the burning of the temple, carried the stench of death. The heart of the Jewish people, once a place of faith and hope, was now reduced to a desolate wasteland. For those who had fought for the survival of the city, the reality of their defeat was unbearable. The zealots, the proud defenders, could no longer claim victory in the face of their utter destruction. Their dreams of an independent Jerusalem had been consumed by flames, and their final acts of defiance now seemed like nothing more than futile resistance. Yet even in the aftermath, something remained, something harder to define. The survivors, broken and scattered, still carried the memories of what Jerusalem had been. For them, the destruction of their city was not just the fall of a physical place. It was the loss of everything they had known. Their faith, their culture, their unity, it was all gone, reduced to dust. The temple's destruction, the heart of their belief, had proven that their God had not answered their prayers. But even in the face of total destruction, there was a question that lingered in the air. Would the spirit of Jerusalem, the very heart of its people, ever be extinguished? Or was there still a flicker of hope left in those who had survived? As the Romans moved on, leaving behind a city of ruins and broken bodies, one question hung over the survivors. What would happen to them now? The Roman forces had conquered the land, but could they crush the soul of its people? With their homes destroyed, their families scattered, and their beliefs shattered, the survivors were left with only one choice: to endure. But for how long?
The fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD marked only the beginning of a darker chapter for the Jewish people. As the Romans swept through the ruins of the city, leaving behind a trail of destruction, the true scope of their conquest began to unfold. The city had fallen, its streets littered with the bodies of the dead, its walls reduced to rubble. But the Romans were not satisfied with mere conquest. For them, the rebellion needed to be erased completely. Their goal was not just to break the spirit of the Jewish people, but to scatter them, remove their presence from Judea, from their sacred land. In the years that followed, the Roman Empire moved swiftly to solidify its grip on the region. The remnants of Jewish resistance were quickly crushed, and Roman legions began to occupy every corner of Judea. Roman rule was no longer a distant presence. It was embedded in every city, in every village. They established a strict military governance, marking the land as a Roman province, with a visible Roman military presence to remind the people that resistance was futile. But it wasn't just military rule that ensured submission. It was the complete disbanding of Jewish societal structures, the institutions that had once held the community together. The survivors of Jerusalem were subjected to the worst of Roman occupation. The zealots who had fought so fiercely for their independence were either killed or enslaved. The proud defenders who had stood their ground in the face of Roman artillery and siege works were now powerless, scattered across the Roman Empire. Many were sold into slavery, their futures uncertain, their identities stripped from them. Families that had been torn apart by the brutality of the Roman forces had little hope of ever being reunited. Children, taken from their parents, were sold into servitude, their names erased, their futures shaped by the whims of their conquerors. And then came the final blow to the Jewish heartland, Masada. By 73 AD, this last stronghold of defiance, perched high above the Judean desert, was the final bastion of the Jewish resistance. The Romans had laid siege to the fortress, building massive siege works that would eventually breach the walls of the mountaintop fortress. The defenders of Masada, led by Eleazar ben Yair, held out for months, their spirits unbroken, their determination fierce. But as the Romans neared victory, the Jewish defenders faced a horrific choice: surrender to the Romans or die by their own hands.
In the end, the choice was made for them. The defenders of Masada chose death. Rather than face the humiliation of Roman capture, they took their lives in a collective act of defiance. When the Romans finally entered the fortress, they found nothing but the bodies of those who had refused to submit. The fall of Masada marked the end of organized rebellion in Judea. But for the survivors, scattered across the empire, the true cost of the war had only just begun. With the rebellion broken, the Jewish people were scattered across the vast Roman Empire. Many were sent to the farthest reaches of the empire. Some were transported to the markets of Rome and Alexandria, others to the mines of Egypt and North Africa. They were no longer free people. They were no more than commodities in the hands of their conquerors. Their homes, their temples, their sense of identity, all had been torn apart. The dream of a free Jerusalem was dead. Yet despite this, something remained, a thread of continuity, of memory, and of identity. The survivors, though displaced, still clung to their faith, their customs, and their memories of the city they had lost. For centuries, the Jewish people would wander the earth, scattered, exiled from their homeland. Yet they carried with them the legacy of Jerusalem, even as they were forced to rebuild their lives in lands far from their home. But as the Roman Empire stretched from the west to the east, a question loomed over the survivors. Would the memory of Jerusalem, its faith, its spirit, its people, survive the centuries of exile? Could the Jewish people endure, or would they become nothing more than a footnote in the vast expanse of the Roman Empire? The fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD was not just the end of a city. It marked the beginning of a profound transformation that would echo through history. As the Roman legions razed the city, tearing down its walls and desecrating its sacred temple, the course of the Roman Empire and the Jewish people was irrevocably altered. What had once been a proud, defiant city, a symbol of Jewish identity, was now a smoldering ruin. Yet for both the Romans and the Jews, the destruction of Jerusalem was only the start of something far more consequential. For the Romans, Jerusalem's fall was the final chapter in their long campaign to pacify the East. The victory was a triumph of Roman might, a clear display of the empire's unchallenged strength. The conquest of Jerusalem was celebrated across the empire, with triumphal processions and the spoils of war paraded in Rome. Among these spoils was the menorah, a sacred Jewish artifact taken from the temple. The Romans used their victory to cement their dominance over the eastern provinces, ensuring that no rebellion would threaten their control again.
However, this victory came with a price. While the destruction of Jerusalem ensured that the Jews would no longer pose a serious military threat to Roman rule, it also sowed the seeds of future tensions. The conquest wasn't just a matter of military subjugation, it was a cultural erasure. The Romans had not only defeated a people, they had dismantled a way of life. The harsh policies that followed, including the renaming of Judea to Syria-Palestina, were attempts to erase Jewish identity from the land. Rome's victory, though swift and decisive, would leave scars on the empire. It marked the beginning of a long, simmering resentment that would come to a head in later centuries, particularly with the Bar Kokhba revolt of 132 to 135 AD. The destruction of Jerusalem had not quelled the spirit of rebellion entirely, it had only forced it into a new form. Meanwhile, for the Jewish people, the fall of Jerusalem was a catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. The city that had been their spiritual, political, and cultural center was no more. The temple, the focal point of their worship, was reduced to ashes. Thousands of Jews were slain, while many more were sold into slavery or scattered across the Roman world. The very identity of the Jewish people seemed to be at risk. How could a people who had long defined themselves by their connection to Jerusalem and the temple survive the loss of both? In the years that followed, the survivors found themselves not only exiled from their homeland, but also from their religious heart. Yet, in the shadow of devastation, something remarkable began to root. Rather than being consumed by despair, the Jewish people began to rebuild, not their city, but their faith and their community. By 100 AD, the seeds of Rabbinic Judaism were planted in the city of Yavna, where a group of rabbis worked to reimagine Jewish life in a world without a temple. This new form of Judaism was focused on the study of Torah, prayer, and the community, not on sacrificial rituals in the temple.
The rise of Rabbinic Judaism was a response to an existential crisis. It was a spiritual adaptation to a new reality. Without Jerusalem, the Jewish people had to find a new way to define themselves. They could not rebuild the temple, but they could rebuild their community, their culture, and their faith. The loss of their homeland forced the Jewish people to rethink their relationship with God and their identity as a people. It was a transformation that would allow Judaism to survive the centuries of exile and persecution that followed. And yet, even as the Jewish people began to rebuild, they faced an uncertain future. The Jewish diaspora had begun, and their people were scattered across the Roman world, from Egypt to Mesopotamia, from Spain to Persia. How would they preserve their identity in a world that was often hostile to their existence? The survivors, though determined to maintain their faith, were now a people without a homeland, forced to carry their heritage across vast distances, often alone. The Romans may have thought they had crushed the Jewish spirit with the destruction of Jerusalem, but the Jewish faith proved more resilient than anyone could have predicted. But what did the fall of Jerusalem truly mean? Was it the end of an era for the Jewish people, the loss of everything they had fought for? Or was it the beginning of something new? For the Romans, it was a victory, an affirmation of their power and the assurance of their supremacy in the East. But for the Jews, it was a pivotal moment, a defining loss that would give birth to a new chapter in their history. The legacy of Jerusalem's fall would be written not in the ruins of the city, but in the hearts of those who refused to let their faith die with it. As the years passed, the question remained: could a people, displaced and broken, find a way to preserve their identity without the physical center that had once held them together? The Roman Empire had defeated Jerusalem, but could they erase the spirit of a people whose faith had survived the worst of trials? The answer would unfold in the centuries to come, as the Jewish people, scattered and exiled, found ways to keep the light of Jerusalem burning, even in the darkest of times. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end of this incredible journey through history. We hope you found the story of Jerusalem's rise, fall, and legacy as captivating and thought-provoking as we did. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most pivotal moments in history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another fascinating episode. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think was the most profound impact of Jerusalem's fall? Share your reflections in the comments below, and as always, thank you for watching.